online with the hashtag JFK Junior Forum Live and interact with our student-run Instagram at JFK Junior Forum for behind-the-scenes highlights. Tonight's forum is also co-sponsored by Social Innovation and Change Initiative and the Harvard Kennedy School AAPI Caucus. So everyone, please take your seats now and join me in welcoming our guests and Brittany Butler.
The Social Innovation and Change Initiative here at the Harvard Kennedy School. And that's Palak's daughter. Hi, baby. I think we're going to go to the green room. This is a perfect example of working women and work-life balance. Oh, Bubba. She's needed in many places at the same time. I'm really excited to be moderating the event here tonight because during my time as Executive Director of the Social Innovation Change Initiative here at the Kennedy School, I rarely hear people talking about organizations that are super innovative and pointing to the labor movement or to organizers. And I don't think that's because innovative things aren't happening in this space. I think it could potentially be because of some mindsets that people typically come to when they think about what innovation is and what it takes to drive pushing past the status quo in this country and beyond. And so for me personally, it's exciting, and having had conversations with Palak, she's a visiting social innovator here with the Social Innovation and Change Initiative about the work of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. It's become clear to me that they're actually doing some incredibly innovative things that many of us can learn from. So tonight we're going to explore what's happening on the front lines of the labor movement and the current state, as well as some of the strategies being undertaken to break new ground and keep up with the shifts and protections afforded to the average working person. And then hopefully also, if there's some time, I'd love to take a little bit of time to talk about you two as individuals and how you came into this space in this way. There's always something to glean from learning about the individual as they came into the space, about the work and what's required to get the work done. So there are going to be generalizable lessons, hopefully for many of you, even if you're not like a diehard labor person. We think that there are lessons that can be learned for those who are up against similarly challenging problems where you're trying to grapple something that's so multifaceted, like something that's economic, political, normative, and cognitive in nature, which tonight I hope we get to a little bit in terms of thinking about the challenge that the labor movement faces. Many of the social innovators who we work with and study at SICE are tackling similarly complex issues. They're entrenched across sectors, across industries, across identities, and more. And so we're really happy to have the opportunity to learn from you too. And you're incredibly accomplished, and here you are as this case in point as you operate at this intersection of workers, women, and care. It's just a lot to unpack. So I'm going to give a little spiel about questions. So we're going to talk up here for 30 minutes and then open it up to questions. So line up at the mics once y'all are ready and we give the signal. Question ends with a question mark. I think I've said all of the things. You guys know how it goes. So I want to kick things off thinking about one of the sexier topics that's been coming along, at least as I think about what I've seen in the social innovation space, which is like, what's the future of work? And reposition that question a bit to say, maybe a little less sexy, but I think more grounded in reality, where is the future of work? The American-Canadian science fiction writer William Gibson famously wrote, "The future is here already, it's just unevenly distributed." So where might we already be able to look and see a glimpse of the future? The challenges people are anticipating for all of us as it comes to the future of work must already be happening for some of us. Who is that? Where is that? What do you all see?
First of all, it's such a huge honor to have this time with all of you and to get to speak to you. This is a home of so much brilliant leadership, including this woman who I have the honor of working with every day. And just when I think about the moment that we're in as a country and the role of all of you in this room in getting our democracy on track and strengthening it for the 21st century, I just want to say thank you. And yeah, it's an honor to be here. So when I think about this question of where is the future of work and the future in general, oftentimes when we think about where to go for answers, we think about going to centers of power and influence. And we at the National Domestic Workers Alliance, we firmly believe that if you want to go and see the future, that you need to look no further than in the margins of our economy and in our society. And that comes from our experience of working with domestic workers. We organize this large and growing workforce of mostly women, disproportionately women of color, who work inside of our homes. They work as nannies, caring for our children. They work as house cleaners, helping to maintain sanity and order in our chaotic lives. And they care for our aging parents and loved ones as home care workers. And we call it the work that makes all other work possible, because it makes it possible for all of us to go out and do what we do in the world, knowing that some of the most important aspects of our lives are in really, really good hands. So it's like powering everything kind of behind the scenes. And it's so important, and yet it is some of the most vulnerable and undervalued work in our entire economy. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. It's cultural, right? It's work that's associated with women, and as a profession, Black women and women of color. It's about our history of legal exclusion and our legislative history. In the 1930s, when our labor laws were put into place, two groups of workers were explicitly excluded from basic rights, like the right to form a union, the right to minimum wage. And that was because of our nation's legacy of racial exclusion, that where Southern members of Congress refused to support those labor laws if they included protections for domestic workers and farm workers who were African American at the time. And it's also structural. You could go into any neighborhood in Cambridge and not know which homes are also workplaces. It's not like there's a marker or a sign or a registry anywhere. So it's almost defined by invisibility in that way. And all of these factors create an incredible vulnerability, which means that we have a workforce that works incredibly hard and still can't make ends meet. The overwhelming number of workers are working in poverty or on the brink of poverty, without access to a safety net, without benefits, without job security, without a path to career advancement, right? And it's some of the fastest growing occupations in our entire workforce, because our need for care, especially elder care, is growing exponentially as the baby boom generation ages, right? Turns 70 at a rate of 10,000 people per day and lives longer than ever. So we think about domestic work as in the shadows and in the margins of our economy and our lives, and yet it is so defining of what our future will be in terms of the quality of work, right? More and more people are dealing with the same kinds of conditions that domestic workers have faced for generations. And literally so much work is going to be in this industry in the future. And that is why we say domestic workers are the ultimate futurists.
Do you want to add anything? What about technology, though? Because technology has got to be changing things up. I mean, this has been happening. There's a lot to be learned. And I don't know, Palak, you're like the technology guru in this room. So what about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, in some ways, the question of technology is actually really important in thinking about where the future of work is going, and that's been a dominant thread in the future of work conversation all around the country. And I think in particular in our sector, if you think about, well, if these are the large proportion of the jobs of the future, well, they're also the jobs that technology can't displace, right? The jobs that are fundamentally about caring for each other, and so these jobs at this point, and I've been to the MIT Media Lab and I've been to all kinds of labs around this country, at this point we don't have technology that can actually replace caregivers, especially given when the demand is really going to hit in terms of how many people are going to be needed to be cared for. And so if you think about these as the jobs of the future, a growing segment of the jobs of the future, the fastest growing occupation when you think about childcare and elder care jobs, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has a report that's kind of tracking where the job growth is, right? But there are also jobs that can't be automated or outsourced. And so they're jobs that are here to stay for the foreseeable future. So that's one set of things in terms of like the technology conversation. And then the other is the proliferation of technology platforms and the ways that apps are mediating work is also affecting our sector. So everything that we know about domestic work is being disrupted by technology, and that is the way that people will find work, the way that that work is paid for, the way that the work is mediated, the way that you're asked to communicate both with your employer and others, and some of that is really great and makes technology can really reduce a lot of friction, and at the same time it can also cement the kind of vulnerable conditions and invisible conditions we've had and scale them maybe more rapidly given the way that technology functions in society. And so what's really interesting is the chapter is actually, this chapter is being written right now. It's the proliferation of the way that technology is affecting not only domestic work, but all work, this is the moment for us to actually make an intervention and figure out, how we want to use the emergence of technology and the kind of fourth industrial age, if you will, in a way that disrupts the kind of inequality that we've seen and prevents the exploitation or vulnerable conditions or marginalization that we've seen in the offline economy before it gets cemented in the online economy. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here. And I think in many ways people are looking to domestic workers as the original gig workers for guidance and leadership around, well, you all have been living in these kind of precarious conditions for generations, really. What's the way forward as more and more work in the economy and more people are experiencing the same kinds of conditions?
I'm just smiling because I remember we were talking offline about the anecdote you told me. You went to some lab and they were trying to get a robot to fold a towel.
For 11 years.
They've been working on it for 11 years. Yeah. So these jobs are here to stay because we can't even get a robot to fold a towel, and there's a lot more to do in the house than that. Thank you. That lays the ground really nicely. And so you guys have put your stake in the ground around organizing being at the heart of the solution, which is not, as I was sort of alluding to in the opening, the first thing that people who are thinking about the future of anything jump to. Like organizing is like age old. So why are you using organizing as such an important part of your strategy? And how have you structured NDWA to build your capacity for that? Because I think there's a lot of people in the room who can think in their own context, and I do encourage you all to think about whatever problems you're trying to work on, what the lessons learned could be from this conversation.
Well, we live in an age of unprecedented inequality. And we believe it's not just inequality in wealth or income or by race, but it's inequality in terms of power. And that if we want to address the challenges that we face, we're going to have to put more power in the hands of more everyday people. And that's what organizing is about. It's about democratizing power. And for us, it's also really a practical matter. We believe that when the people who are closest to the problem are at the center of your solutions are actually much more impactful. And in the end, you develop lasting solutions. And so that's, we really structure it so that domestic workers are at the center of everything we do. We have many different strategies to build power. We want to change policy. We want to change politics and the electoral arena. We want to change the narrative and our culture, and we want to change how the economy functions. And at the heart of all of that is workers, really driving how that unfolds. And it's like workers are our members, and they elect our board, and they're our boss, and we have councils of workers in childcare and cleaning and in elder care, and they have set the North Star for what they believe a good job in this industry should be. And we're really working to try to realize that on all of these different fronts. And it's kind of gives you an idea of how we try to structure it so that they really are in the center of our solutions and our strategies.
Mm-hmm. Anything else?
Yeah, I mean, so, 5 years ago, our movement launched our innovation arm, which is called NDWA Labs. And part of what we're doing in NDWA Labs is thinking about new strategies and ways in which we can accomplish our goals, which is to transform this industry to be fundamentally a good place to work, and one where you can raise your family and do better than the previous generation. And one of the things that we've been exploring a lot in NDWA Labs is essentially testing this hypothesis, furthering the hypothesis that technology we can harness the power of technology to be in service of the goals of our social movement. And, an example of the way that we've structured that is in even the product development process, the kinds of checkpoints and sessions that we have with our worker leaders, not just as users, but as leaders and strategic leaders for our movement, have presented really important feedback at very important forks in the road, especially when you're building something that's an early stage venture, right? So we last year launched the first portable benefits platform in the country, and it's called ALEA. And the basic idea around it was to allow for domestic workers who have never ever had a social safety net or benefits be able to access one. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the larger point being, in the earliest stage of building something that is a robust technological platform, you're always going to be at a fork in the road. And that's really when we've gone to our worker councils and our leaders to say, okay, if we were going to do this the kind of commercial technology route, we would probably pick the easiest problem to solve and solve for that, because kind of that's how it works, right? Versus saying, okay, we're at this fork in the road, and we could either test this idea of a portable social safety net with people who have citizenship or who have bank accounts or who speak English because we're trying to prove the concept. Or we could say, let's actually take the hardest use case, because our movement has a mantra where we will leave nobody behind. And we'll actually design for the hardest use case first, because we believe it will actually serve everybody in the constituency. And I think at those kinds of decisions, the workers have been 100% clear in offering guidance to say, we don't care if it takes you a year to get through all the legal innovation and technological innovation. We will not build something from our movement, even in the first case, even to prove the concept, that doesn't actually serve every single person in our movement.
So interesting, because if you think about innovation in the for-profit space, you're going to hear a lot of pushing on find your beachhead market, make it super niche and narrow, go with the easiest, wherever you're going to get traction first. Figure out that narrow persona and don't design for anybody else. And yet you guys are at the heart of the worker rights movement, the women's movement, immigration movement, more. And that's a trend, right? Whole person politics. And not to sound like a jerk or anything, but is that a help or a hindrance all the time? Because that is really hard to do. Or is it? I don't know.
It is hard. Well, all organizing is hard.
Yeah.
And it's also really, really important, uniquely impactful. But I would say that the kind of organizing we do, we really draw from the framework that Kimberly Crenshaw and other Black feminists developed, called Intersectionality. And the reason why we think it's this powerful tool is because it really helps us understand how to organize in a way that is not zero-sum, where you're not making trade-offs, that are actually not necessary to make. I often talk about intersectionality as like when you go into the movie theaters in a 3D movie, and you put on those 3D glasses, and all of a sudden everything is three-dimensional. Like you get new dimensions when you put the glasses on. That's what intersectionality does for us. It's basically a way of looking at the world where you get to see all the different ways that hierarchies of power are shaping our reality, along lines of race, along lines of gender, and many other lines. And when you put on the 3D glasses and you can see all of those different dimensions, then you actually see the world more clearly and more accurately and more holistically. And then your strategies can actually be more effective. And you can also see allies in ways that you might not see. You see opportunities to make progress and build alliances that you might not see otherwise. It's like, it really is this magic tool. Whereas somebody might say like, oh, it's like you're taking on too much, or aren't you overextended, or what. We actually feel like it's this incredibly powerful tool to aggregate power and to ensure that your solutions are much more effective in the end.
And organizing is also about timing. And when you have a three-dimensional lens, you're able to move and break through when the timing is actually right. And if you confine yourself to a flat way or a one-dimensional way of looking at the world, I mean, ultimately, it doesn't give you as much, from a pragmatic, strategic operating sense, it doesn't give you as much maneuverability as you want, because you are kind of able to run the ball down the field when you get possession of it, basically.
Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, I do feel like the root of so many of the big problems and challenges that we need to address in the 21st century, the root of it is that there is a hierarchy of human value that really structures our economy and our society, our culture, our norms, and that if we don't actively try to interrogate that hierarchy at all times, we run the risk of replicating and reinforcing it.
Yeah.
I so appreciate like the sophistication of your analysis of the problem, because I think that is, it's an easy pitfall, right? Like you see one problem through only one lens. It's economic, it's relational or normative, like rights-based, like this group is more powerful than the other, or it's, even cognitive in nature, like these people don't have this information and they just need this information, or it's political, like if we just pass this law, like everything will be fine. I think a lot of people in this room know like that just one approach, or have struggled with, just one approach to a problem. And I think it's really insightful the way that you've unpacked the different pieces and want to actually, this is perfect transition, get into next, the different tools in your tool belt that you have pulled out for different aspects of the problem. So just taking the last year as an example, which is insane, you've had an initiative that's been cultural, so partnering with Roma, the movie, in Hollywood, and all that entails, to shift mindsets around what it means to be a domestic worker. One is political policy, this federal Bill of Rights, and a lot of the domestic worker Bill of Rights work that you've done up until now. And then one is this product, Aaliyah, and I think there are probably more too, but can you just unpack these examples? I would like to give a quick overview of each, and sort of maybe we can get to your rationale for taking them on after you describe them a bit. And again, to the audience, think about sort of each of these threads and whether you're pulling on those types of resources as you tackle the challenges that you're taking on, right? So there's the cultural change, there's political change, and then there's an economic play going on with the product. And each of those requires different capacities, different skill sets, and organizational structure. So, yeah.
Well, with domestic work, there's that deep cultural devaluing of domestic work as women's work. and associated with women of color, we've always known that that changing policy is not going to be enough. That we have to change policy, and we have to address exclusion, and we have to create frameworks for rights, absolutely. But there will be a limit to the effectiveness of that unless we also change culture, right? And then there will be a limit to what we can do in the cultural arena if we're not also changing the electoral arena and the economic arena. So we've created a movement building framework that allows us to do work in all of these different arenas of power and influence in a way that is connected. And where one set of strategies can be in the service of the other at all times. And a good example of this is the narrative change work we did with the film Roma. How many of you saw the film Roma? Okay. If you haven't seen it yet, it's on Netflix, absolutely worthwhile. But the protagonist of Roma is an indigenous domestic worker in Mexico. And it was a really unprecedented opportunity for us to have a popular culture narrative where the domestic worker was the protagonist. She was a three-dimensional. You saw her gossiping with her friends, making out in a movie theater, like really being a whole human being, and also working in the incredible value that she provided the family that she lived with. And we were able to take that story and open it up to all of the domestic workers in the world and all of the domestic workers in the United States, and how might the story of Cleo create that moment where we have a little bit more space in the public imagination for the story of domestic workers, open it up and bring attention to all the domestic workers who are doing that work here, and then connect it to the need for a federal domestic worker bill of rights, which we timed to be introduced or announced at the same time as Roma was coming live online. And so the two were able to really amplify each other. And we learned to do this really from two different scenarios. One, if you think about the Affordable Care Act and the fact that we won the policy long before we won the narrative. In fact, we lost the narrative for many years, and we only started to get the narrative back as we were in jeopardy of losing the policy, right? And so you can win policy, and if you don't win the narrative, your policy win will always be vulnerable. Right? And so these two things, we kind of saw that play out and said, how do we organize in such a way where we can win the narrative as well? And then we watched the way the LGBT movement actually really leaned into popular culture storytelling with shows like Will and Grace and Glee, right? They really prefigured a world where the freedom to love who you choose was the new normal. Right? And the combination of that work with policy work for marriage equality in states and then ultimately nationally just transformed reality on those issues for us. So we've been learning as we go how to make these connections and draw power across these strategies.
It's amazing.
And I would add that, all of this from the perspective of the social movement, the domestic workers across this country, all of this is in service of disrupting inherently unbalanced power relationships, right? So it's not because Hollywood is sexy and therefore we're part of this is about disrupting dominant ideas about the way that people view the women who do this work and the work itself. And Hollywood, this fact that Roma won an Academy Award, that Alfonso Cuarón is one of the most respected directors in the world, allows for us to create a platform to push the boundaries as much as we can to disrupt that. And that's the same is true even when we're building products, right? We're not trying to mimic what Silicon Valley is doing, but we're actually saying, look, the way that aggregation is happening on technology platforms is an opportunity for organizing. And how do we build products or how do we build technology platforms that actually are fundamentally in service of the core goals of our movement, right? Which is, I think, an iteration, Brittany, and you and I have talked a lot about this on the SCIC community here at Harvard around social enterprise 1.0 and what that means, and how do we move from social enterprise 1.0, where not everybody, but a large portion of that has been about optimizing within suboptimal conditions, and how is it that we push the boundaries of what social enterprise really means to embrace social change and power disruption. And we are, you know, we're not there, but we are part of, I think we want to be a part of that advanced team for really thinking about what social enterprise 2.0, social entrepreneurship 2.0, what does that really look like when we embrace the task of disrupting power?
And you're really, I mean, you're like spending time in Silicon Valley too. I mean, it's another piece. It's just you got to be where that work is happening, because it's the
I mean, we would be happy for
there.
Silicon Valley to embrace, you know, in this way, in terms of not this, the question of disruption is kind of a well worn out phrase. But I think what I think we mean by it is to say, okay, well, like, let's actually disrupt the idea that your only users are your monetized customers, but actually your users are everybody. Like, workers are users of the platform, and they deserve a kind of equal stake in terms of being served by the models that are out there. That's actually just not true. Like, the predominant models that are out there right now that the commercial markets are producing actually kind of look at workers as an afterthought, a PS, and that's obviously a very widespread, you know, debate right now in terms of the way that technology companies are reshaping work.
And something very worrying for all of us if domestic workers are the future of work for all of us. Okay, so we can't go on like without talking about policy, because we're at a policy school. So what's next on the policy front? Are there, you're already doing a lot, but are there other exciting things going on?
There are. Well, I just mentioned earlier about our National Bill of Rights for domestic workers. It's a new framework for rights to bring this workforce into the 21st century, so these jobs can be on track to becoming good jobs that you can take pride in. But one of the things that we want to recognize is that in this country, families on the whole have no support when it comes to affording or managing care. Right? That if 70% of the American workforce earns less than $50,000 per year, and the average cost of childcare is more than $10,000 per year, and then the average cost of a private room in a nursing home facility is more than $90,000 per year, the numbers actually don't add up. If most workers are barely earning a living wage themselves, how are they going to pay a care worker a living wage, right? So what we want to do, we believe that this moment when we need more care than ever before, right? With a growing older population, millennials starting to have children, 4 million babies born per year, we need more care than ever before. And we used to be able to rely upon women who would stay home and take care of family members. That hasn't been the case for several decades, right? And so we actually have no infrastructure in place to support the exponential increase in care that we're going to need. So we see this as an incredible opportunity to revolutionize our care infrastructure and bring it into the 21st century. And our idea for how to do that is called universal family care. The idea that there should be one social insurance fund that we're all contributing to, that we can all benefit from, that helps us afford childcare, elder care, support for people with disabilities, and paid family leave. Basically everything you need to take care of your families while you're working, right? Kind of common sense on one level. Universal access. We all have families, and we all want to be working. And this would serve to cover costs of care across the lifespan. It would be flexible and portable. And we believe that it would invest in the care economy as infrastructure to such an extent that we could make every last care job a living wage job with real economic security.
So
Doesn't that sound great?
Yeah, it does. And you were just talking about this in Iowa? Yeah?
Yeah.
That's
and
exciting.
We just got our first candidate for president to officially endorse it.
Yay.
Secretary Castro.
I was like, yeah, who?
Secretary
cool.
Castro.
That's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
And then Palak is actually, as I mentioned here, as a visiting social innovator, which means we get to have her back on campus multiple times per year, and she's actually committed, and we're so grateful, to do some of her intellectual heavy lifting here while on campus, and there are actually opportunities for people to plug into that. And it's this idea of a 21st century labor policy framework that centers workers, as she was saying, instead of employers. Do you want to say a little plug about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I referenced it a little bit earlier in terms of the way that technology is reshaping labor markets. And one of the things that I call IGen about at like 2 in the morning, I'm like, oh my God, how are we going to deal with this? Is the fact that what's really, I think, concerning about what we're starting to see emerge is the way that technology capital is privatizing, digitizing, and corporatizing the labor market itself. So this is one level above the conditions of work, which we also need to pay attention to, that people have the right to have a say at work, or the right to be in a union, or fair wages and a contract, and all of those things we should definitely be continuing to fight for. And one concerning thing is one level above that, which is who's controlling how the labor market functions, who's controlling who has access to it, who's controlling how it develops, who's determining the norms of that. And because of the flatness and the rapid ability for technology to scale with endless deep pockets coming from venture capital and the investor community, I think it's a question that the school should really take up in terms of thinking about, well, is there an appropriate regulatory framework here that we want to be thinking about as this type of labor market grows and proliferates. So that's the question that we'll be taking up in a year-long working group here to think about, is it something that's a parallel to antitrust frameworks? Is it something around monopsony regulation? Is it borrowing from co-determination and ways of maybe potentially thinking about labor markets as public utilities, for example? So I don't actually know what the answer is, which is kind of fun to be back at Harvard trying to take up a question that feels really current and really urgent right now.
Yeah. So we have like a handout that we can pass around, or you can come up and just sign up if you're interested in connecting. We'll probably kick that off with a meeting or a convening of some kind to see who's expressing interest and across faculty, and definitely be pulling in other schools from around Harvard too. For a series of basically working sessions, I think, that'll start to tackle that. We're not going to solve it in 1 year, but it'd be very cool to be a part of that, I think, conversation. Okay, so this is all really exciting. And before we turn to questions for the audience, although audience, start to think about your questions, I would like to zoom out, or maybe I'm zooming in, I don't know which, and learn more about what brought you all to this movement, and what keeps you excited about it. Sometimes those of us, particularly in like very cerebral fields, can get really caught up in the analysis of a problem. So like, this is the problem and this is the solution, and we forget to put ourselves into the conversation. And it's a mistake, as you heard tonight, even potentially a strategic mistake. So one of the things that organizers in particular always remind me is how important it is to connect sort of who you are to the problem that you're trying to tackle. It's an issue related to legitimacy and credibility and your personal sources of power. And we've been starting to teach at SciC about that quite a bit, how including that analysis can actually help like hone your strategy too. Mm-hmm. In case in point, you two are like very different people, and yet you're here working on this same cause. I realized in the flurry of the introduction that I didn't get to say just a little bit more about how accomplished you all are, so I'll just say that Ai-jen Poo is the co-founder and ED of NDWA, and so along with Cecile Richards, Alicia Garza, Ai-jen actually also co-founded the Supermajority, which I don't know if you all know about, in addition to her work at NDWA, which is this new home for activism, training, mobilizing a multiracial, intergenerational community who are going to fight for gender equity together. She's been recognized among Fortune's 50 world greatest leaders and Time's 100 most influential people in the world. She's also a MacArthur genius, need I go on. So very accomplished and choosing to be here doing this work. So we'd love to hear a little bit about how you took that path and came to this place. And then Palak, really briefly, Palak Shah, first and foremost, an HKS alum. I should have shouted that out right from the start. Whoop, whoop. I think MPP, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. What cohort? And just say alpha.
2009.
Okay. She's also the Social Innovation Director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and also is the founding director of the NDWA Labs, which is this sort of innovation arm of NDWA. And so she's got this experience with sort of innovating herself. She's done a span in the private, the public, and the nonprofit sectors, and done innovation work across all those. So I'd love to hear, because that's a very different path, how you came to this place.
Well, I have to say that one of my proudest accomplishments is being able to surround myself with women who are smarter than me, like Palak. It's really such a joy to work with the team that I have. But in terms of how I came to this work, I feel like there's two moments that I'll share, because it's such an evolving thing. If you had told me years ago that I would be leading a national organization of domestic workers, I would have thought you were nuts.
It's all right.
But, I was volunteering when I was in college. I was volunteering at a domestic violence shelter for Asian immigrant women. And because my grandmother raised me, I could speak Mandarin, so I worked the hotline at night. And a lot of the calls to the hotline many of the calls were about the violence and the abuse and kind of navigating that. And then a lot of the calls were also about the struggles of being poor and working incredibly hard, but still not being able to pay the rent, pay the bills on time, put healthy food on the table for your kids. And I just thought, how could it be that these women, against all odds, right, have survived untold experiences of violence and are working incredibly hard and trying to build a life for themselves and their kids, and they can't do it? It doesn't make any sense, right? So that's kind of how I was like, why and why is this happening and how do we change it? Kind of led me to the path of organizing. And then the other thing was, on campus in college, I wanted to be an ethnic studies major. I was at Columbia University in New York, and I really wanted to major in ethnic studies. And Columbia didn't have an ethnic studies department or major. There was some African American studies and a few courses in Asian American studies, but no major, no minor, no permanent faculty, and then same for Latino studies. And we formed a coalition in my senior year for ethnic studies and launched a campaign that involved lots of organizing, lots of campaigning and direct action. There was a 14-day hunger strike, multiple building takeovers, and almost didn't graduate. And and we won. There is now a Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race at Columbia, and now a little girl like me can major in Asian American studies or ethnic studies at Columbia. And it made me feel like it really opened my eyes to the power of organizing and campaigning, and that you can actually win stuff is amazing. And so that kind of gave me, I caught the bug. Yeah.
That's pretty rad.
Well, I think for me, very early in my life, I would say my mom, who's actually here tonight, was was very influential because she was very motivated by Hindu spiritual philosophy and was very learned in that. And a core tenet, basically, of summarizing generations, millennia of Hinduism, is basically that we're all one, right? This idea that we're not separate than each other. And so as I was growing up, I would like have, there's like deep philosophical discussions around different components of like Hindu spiritual philosophy, not from a ritualistic sense, but from like a moral and a philosophical sense. And then when I would like examine the world around me, I was just continuously hit by the profound contradictions between that kind of ideal and like what was actually existing in the world. And just like, it's almost like the blue screen of death, like you can't compute it. Like you're just like, wait, but this is really not how the world is functioning, and feeling this kind of deep moral impulse around both like seeing the contradiction, but actually really wanting to resolve it. And like learning early on through a number of different experiences that the only way to do that is like people really coming, the only sustainable long-term way to do it is like people really coming together and exerting their power together. But, kind of more professionally, Brittany, I will say that, I'm so grateful for the training that I have gotten through all the organizing experiences, but also by coming here and getting access to a whole set of tools and frameworks and language that I think actually makes me more effective in all the different rooms and circles I'm in, representing 2.5 million workers in this country. And I often will say, like, I've had some great jobs. I've worked for Deval Patrick. I've worked, running hospital healthcare systems, implementing the ACA. I've worked in management consulting, and I will literally say, I want to have the best boss ever, but two, that this is literally the greatest combination and place for me to exert all of that training, all of those experiences, kind of at the forefront of, I would say one of the most important times in terms of fighting inequality, economic inequality, and political inequality, and all the forms of inequality. I couldn't be better trained from all of those experiences to come and have the privilege and honor of serving in the domestic worker movement.
That's probably a good note to transition over to questions on. Thank you both. Let's do every other. So let's start over here, and then we'll go back and forth. I'm looking at you. Oh, these in the row. Okay, wow, we got a lot. So we'll go clockwise. Okay, so we'll go. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name's Kiana. I'm a sophomore at the college. Since we are on a college campus, my question is, what is one piece of advice you would give to young people who are interested in making an impact in pursuing the kind of cultural, social, and economic change that you are working to affect every day?
Do you want to go first?
No, go ahead.
I mean, I believe in organizing, and I think that we're in an organizing renaissance right now, and I think that young people can transform both the country and what it means to do organizing. I think that the way that this younger generation is organizing is the opposite of the zero sum that when we were trained younger, like 25 years ago, we were kind of trained in more narrow frameworks, and what I'm seeing right now is this energy around there's room for all of it, that we can be fighting against climate change and for gender equity and for all of the things that we care about, and we don't have to choose, right? That's what we call whole person politics, is really advancing a way of doing social change work that is holistic and allows people to be their whole selves in that work. And I just really look forward to more of that kind of organizing, that kind of leadership. The other thing I would say is that it's really hard, and if you feel disillusioned at times or frustrated, that's totally normal. And the payoff is like nothing else. So stick with it.
Do you want to just make a quick distinction between organizing and activism for the audience? I know it's not a quick question, but because you said organizing.
Organizing is about building power. There's a lot of different kinds of activism, and I feel like specifically, organizing is about building community and power in a way that's lasting, whereas I think you can change a lot through activism, but you may not necessarily be building power that you can sustain and grow over time. And a lot of that has to do with relationships and connection between people, which takes time to build.
Thank you, it's helpful. Okay, up in the rafters here.
Hi, I'm Lyle. I'm a junior at the college. Y'all talked earlier about the success of Roma and taking back the narrative of domestic workers. So given that we have an entertainment industry that can often trivialize or misrepresent groups of people and their story, I'm wondering what you see as the next best steps for the entertainment industry or popular culture more generally to continue to tell that narrative honestly and with purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Good questions tonight.
Yeah, great question. I mean, we are essentially in this country in a fight for the story of who we are and who we can become. And we have allies in the entertainment industry who want to do storytelling that democratizes that story, that actually is much more reflective of who we are as a country and values that are about inclusion and equity and dignity and humanity. So it's important to partner, find those allies and with storytellers, and it's also important for us to tell our own stories on our terms, and to the extent that we can connect them to popular culture moments that have momentum. I mean, that's a lot of what we did with Roma. It was about Roma, but it was about our ability to utilize Roma to tell the story of domestic workers in real life today. And you can utilize any kind of moment. You can try to really channel that energy at any given time. I mean, I think Andrew Slack calls it cultural acupuncture, where you're basically channeling the energy in the narrative environment towards our values, right? And so you can take a story that's out there and try to take the energy from it and move it towards more authentic stories as well through organizing.
But I think in relationship to the previous question too, I think this is why we need institutions and we need organizations that kind of can be the basis for that kind of activity. So we had a culture change strategy at NDWA long before the film Roma came out. I mean, this has been one of, I think, the innovations of, you know, a labor organization, and we see ourselves squarely within the labor movement, of course, and so it was one of the innovations that we were experimenting with and offering, and when the moment arose, we actually were ready to take advantage of that moment.
And there was a predecessor to that too. You were involved with The Help also, the film The Help, a little bit, and taking advantage of that as a precursor. Yeah. So
that was the first time that we engaged in a storytelling campaign, a cultural campaign like that, was around the film The Help. And that was 8 years ago. So we've had 8 years of learning how to do this kind of organizing, so that when Roma came around, we were able to seize the moment. But there's so many different ways of doing that storytelling work, and so many stories to be told. Yeah,
it sounds like a combination of like an emergent and a deliberate strategy. You know, you have this like clear like end game, but then you kind of have to see what else is happening out there in the ecosystem, what emerges, and go with that flow, which is, you know, what a lot of business schools talk about is most important too. So it's so interesting for me to see the themes coming up in your work as well. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Carson. I'm a freshman at the college, and I was just wondering if you have heard a story from a domestic worker that you've worked with that gives you hope about the progress you're making?
Do you want to do one from Elliot? About the progress we're making.
Oh, the progress we're making. Oh, there's so many stories about this. I mean, I can certainly tell you the story of Olivia, who is one of our early adopters on the Aliyah platform. Olivia, she's been someone who's been working as a house cleaner for over a decade. And the main problem with house cleaners in this country is that when they don't go to work, they often don't get paid. They lose their income. And Complicating that is they work for many people. And so there's no one really, like if you go to work here at Harvard, or you work in a factory, or you work in a restaurant, you've got that one employer and that's where you work, and they've got a set of obligations under the law toward you. But when you work here and there in gigs, like nobody has that full responsibility for you. And so when we actually launched the Aaliyah platform for the first time, she was able to take a paid day off and not lose her income when she doesn't go to work. And like Olivia, there's Veronica, who was able to like attend, you know, her daughter's graduation without like losing pay. And there's so many stories, even just within, you know, the ability for us to like launch an early stage platform like Aaliyah. But in terms of, you know, I remember going to all the Roma screenings and the kind of awe and appreciation that came from our members in seeing their stories on the big screen in Hollywood, and coming out of the theater being like, that story was about me. I mean, you know, there's just so many stories, and I think that's really the beauty of, and to your earlier question, the difference between, I think, advocacy and organizing to some extent is that the domestic workers are front and center of all of the different things that we're doing as kind of active protagonists contending for their own future.
Thank you. Annie?
Hi, my name's Annie Trank. I work here at the Kennedy School. So you've already talked about Roma, you've already talked about the help, but I still have a nagging question about the dignity of domestic workers and how racism and bigotry can really sully that dignity and really steal it away from domestic workers. And in addition to the wonderful work of Roma and the help, what can be done, and what is NDWA's role in raising the consciousness of the cultural bridges that need to be built between consumers of domestic work and the domestic workers themselves in order to maintain and help that dignity thrive and just be an accepted fact?
Good question.
We have a sister organization called Hand in Hand, which is a network of employers who employ domestic workers who really want to be a part of the solution, and they've created all kinds of discussion guides and toolkits for people who are hiring other people in their homes. And they've created kind of a safe space for employers to process the relationship and to be able to come to the relationship from a healthy place, right? Really trying to understand, right, get a sense of how the context for the domestic worker and how there are simple things that they can do to make it easier and have the relationship be much more healthy and transparent and professional, and the kind of pitfalls that can often happen in the relationship. So Hand in Hand is an incredible resource, and they've recently been really involved in work that we also lead with Families Belong Together around the kind of separation of families that's happening at our border and the treatment of refugees and children and families in detention. And immigration is also very much intertwined in our industry. There's a huge percentage of our workforce is immigrant, and immigration is so much at the forefront of our political conversation right now. And so Hand in Hand has also developed resources to help employers think through those questions and how they can be a part of the solution there, as well as another example that may be more about the cultural pieces.
That's great. I'm going to start back over here.
Hi, thank you both so much. My name is Jeff Rousset. I'm a recent HKS alum. First of all, I want to make a really quick pitch for Marshall Gans's course in organizing for folks who are interested in learning more and potentially supporting National Domestic Workers Alliance through coursework and getting credit. I'm an organizer, and there's a book out there called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded that talks about kind of the tension between nonprofit and civic engagement models, and often having to fundraise from like corporate philanthropies and foundations. What have you all learned about how to build power, how to fundraise, how social movement leaders and participants can fundraise and raise money in order to build people power.
We talk about this all the time.
Do you want to take this one?
Why don't you kick us off, I think, and then I can talk about how do we get to independence?
Okay, great. I want to hear this.
I know, me too.
No, I think that, one, that the domestic workers deserve all the resources in the world to build this movement. And our perspective is, as long as we're not compromising or trading our values or making decisions about our work in order to maintain funding or compromising our values in any kind of way, that we should welcome the resources and support for growing our organization, and we should have a really diverse revenue stream. So we've been trying to diversify for the last decade, and I think we're making progress both in terms of individual donors and grassroots fundraising through online contributions, and Palak's whole body of work. What a big part of her mandate is to help us think this through as well. So for us, it's all about how do we generate revenue to support the work that we need to do in ways that are sustainable and don't compromise our values. And I feel really proud to say that we've been able to do that so far. And, you know, we never know. There could be another financial crisis, and that could affect a huge portion of our funding. So we have to prepare for those scenarios, and it's not ideal. I wish we were more independent, which is why Palak is going to take the next part of the answer.
Well, I mean, you know, it's hard to generate revenue. If anybody's built a business before or tried to raise money, whether it's, you know, in a charitable giving context or whether it's in a market, you know, exchange of some kind, it's hard to raise money. And that's just the hard reality that we actually need resources to do the work. I think in terms of independence, you know, there's a lot of activity right now in the labor movement thinking about membership models and thinking about how you resource the organizing that's needed. And there's been a lot of really great experimentation across the whole labor movement around membership associations and thinking about the attack on unions and how is it that we continue to emerge from all of this with strong memberships and the contributions that workers themselves are making. And so we're also in that, you know, we've also made a step in that direction at NDWA, moving towards, you know, at our founding being an alliance of organization and expanding to an individual membership association where any domestic worker across this country can join. I have a very particular nuanced point of view about this, where I actually believe whatever membership we offer, we should be delivering 100 times more value than we're capturing. And how is it that you actually do that in the kind of open waters of voluntary membership, right? And so it's a very nuanced conversation that is really a ripe place of innovation and discussion across the labor movement. And then I think what's really cool about the NDWA Labs ventures and the kinds of things that are in early stage prototypes is that the idea would be to be building power, organizing workers, and figuring out some way to generate, again, another diversified revenue stream that goes right back into the work, right? Doesn't have a private beneficiary, but actually the social movement owns all of the ventures and all of the things that are coming out of the labs to then kind of have dividends going back into the movement. So we've not figured it out. I don't know anybody else that totally has either, but it's a really good question, one that we should really interrogate seriously and continue to move forward and make as much progress as we can.
That's a pretty rad answer. Yeah.
My name's Elizabeth. I'm a sophomore at the college and a member of the JFK Junior Forum Committee. And I was wondering if you have any specific plans for making sure that domestic workers can get to the polls in the upcoming presidential election.
So glad you asked this question.
Out the mouths of babes.
I'm so glad you asked this question. Yes, we have a major voter program to mobilize women of color voters to get to the polls. And that we are focusing in a bunch of places: North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, New Mexico, Nevada, Pennsylvania, where we're going to be building very large-scale voter mobilization, voter registration, and voter mobilization programs within NDWA. And we also have a 501c4 sister organization called Care in Action, which is focused on advocacy on the issues that have to do with elevating care workers and the care economy, and it's focused on building the political power of women of color. And that Care in Action is working in Virginia as we speak, and has just announced an endorsed slate of incredible women of color candidates for the state legislature. And so really active in Virginia right now. And we did a lot of research about the voting habits of women of color voters and found that a third of all voting eligible Latinas are not registered. So there's going to be a big voter registration effort that we'll be a part of. And we're just really excited because we think women of color are going to make a huge difference this year. And we saw it in Georgia last year, where women of color really drove the expansion of the electorate in Georgia in ways that we can't go back, right? And I'm just looking forward to seeing that happen in states all over the country. We're also part of a new organization called Supermajority, which is going to be training 2 million women to mobilize millions more to the polls in November of 2020. So we're really excited about that. If you're interested in getting plugged in, supermajority.com. We're currently on an organizing tour across the country. I'll be joining the bus, which is arriving in Milwaukee today. But we've been to, I think, 9 or 10 cities so far, doing training and talking to women about what it's going to take to get to 2 million. And there's a ton of energy. People are on fire, and let's do this.
Sir?
Hi. Hello, and thank you for your work. I'm Jerry Scapitulo, co-chair of Pride at Work, AFL-CIO in Massachusetts. We're the official constituency group for LGBTQ and organized labor, and I'd be interested in how you would assess the victory of District 1199 in putting about 25,000 personal care attendants under contract in Massachusetts. They just got $15 an hour. And can your workers bargain collectively? Do they have a grievance procedure? Can they negotiate for working conditions, holidays, paid time off, and so forth? Thank you.
Well, that's a great victory, and congratulations on that. The domestic workers in the private pay market are prohibited from collective bargaining and are excluded from the National Labor Relations Act. So technically and legally, domestic workers do not have the right to form a union or collectively bargain. But, and so we are in solidarity with the organized parts of the home care markets and home care workers, where the real innovation, I think, from the labor movement has been to designate the state as essentially the payer or the employer, or at least the financing of the care, and it's a real incredible, I think, innovation in doing that. But it is limited in the sense that if you don't have a relationship to government subsidy or a government payer, there is still no bargaining partner. And so a lot of our work has really its roots in the part of the market where the structural employment relationship is one-to-one, one worker to one household. And while, of course, as we've said, we, are deeply entrenched in an organizing model, the same structure of collective bargaining as we know it, not the principle, but the actual structure, needs some. We need to be able to figure out how it applies in the one-to-one employment context. And so, to answer your question, I think, kind of in spirit and in principle, we're there. Legally and technically, we're not. And even if we were, we would need to find a new path forward. In many ways, it's an exciting but also terrifying place to be, because it's the edges, I think, of what we've been able to accomplish so far with the social contract and what gets protected by being an employee in this country. And there are so many more people that are working in all kinds of ways, working 40, 50, 80, 100 hours a week, that don't have access to that. And it's our objective to figure out how we can raise the floor for everybody.
Thank you. It's a great question. Nice to tie it to the other parts of the labor movement. We probably have room for 2 or 3. One more. Sir, you're the lucky winner. No, we went around. Fair is fair.
Hi, my name is Iwei. I'm an alum of the Harvard Kennedy School Asian American Pacific Islander Caucus. And thank you both for coming here today and for your work. I work in the health and healthcare space, but I'm actually have volunteered as an interfaith organizer for a number of years. And I think a big part of the experience, in addition to kind of winning victories and issues, is the kind of the relationships in these sort of apolitical spaces. One of them is here today, on Sundays. And what I haven't really been involved with in terms of organizing is kind of different arenas that are national or kind of online or sort of not just local. And you mentioned earlier that kind of domestic workers have sort of already experienced the gig economy a little bit and organizing sort of in these places that don't say, workspaces on them or at their workplaces. I'm curious, how have you seen your constituencies kind of build community and solidarity without maybe the physical space that some of us organize around?
That's a great question. Talk about the Facebook group.
Yeah, I can. I mean, I think a common problem with domestic workers, whether it's online or offline, is the isolation that people are feeling. Because you're often working alone, which is different than more traditional workplaces where people congregate or they go somewhere and you have a place of work, as you're saying. There is a place of work, it's just one person is only working in that place of work, and each person is working in a different place of work. So the offline conditions of that, even just from an organizing perspective, are already challenging. And then I think it's similar conditions in terms of online, because even if you're finding your work online or you're getting dispatched through an online intermediary, you're still ending up in an isolated workplace. So what's really cool, I think, about what's emerging and the role that technology can play is that it allows for us to create virtual spaces of aggregation, and that can take place on our own proprietary platforms that we're building, but it also takes place on Facebook and it takes place on social media. And what we have seen is like an emergence of digital organizing, not as a destination, but as a method or as a vehicle for finding people who've been extremely hard to find. And then all of these people are really busy. People are working all day and all night to just make it to the end of the week to make sure that they can pay their bills. And so offering another way to be in relationship to the social movement, offering another place for workers to connect with each other, whether that's through Facebook groups or through WhatsApp, or there's all kinds of ways that people are finding each other, is, I think, a core part of modernizing the way that we do organizing. And I think a mistake that is happening is to relegate, let's say, okay, out with the old and in with the new. I don't think that's our approach at all. Our approach has been to say this is another way to break that isolation and bring people closer in to all of the different ways in which our movement is operating. But it's really new terrain right now, and there's a lot to invent. It's a really exciting time in organizing, both because there's just kind of this, if you look at what the teachers are doing, and you're looking at the Fight for 15, and you're looking at this kind of energy that's out there, and you've got a whole bunch of new tools that are really ripe for us to harvest and kind of harness in service of building power.
So that was our last question. I hope you all found this conversation as sort of intellectually stimulating and also emotionally compelling, and sort of just like practically very useful, as I thought it would be. Again, there's so much to be learned from the margins, as you all said, and really it's the front lines. And that's been such an illuminating piece of the conversation for me. And I really thank you for bringing that to the forum stage. Yeah, it was an honor to have this conversation. Now go out and share about this amazing stuff with all the people in your communities. Thank you very much for coming tonight, and have a good evening. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.